The Civil War ended in 1865, yet the majority of African Americans remained in the South. Almost 90% of African Americans were Southerners until the 1910s. African Americans were free, but they owned nothing. They spent hundreds of years building America, and they did not have any water, food, clothes, housing, money, tools, land, education, property, businesses, weapons, or protection. During the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. Over 1 million whites received 270 million acres of western land up until 1934. They also received tools, funding, and education from the government. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. expounded on why African Americans continued to suffer economically, yet European immigrants flourished in America. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base, and yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked for free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. Whites perpetuated the narrative that they came to America with nothing and established everything by pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. After the Civil War, many African Americans in the South became sharecroppers. They intended to work for their former slave owners in return for crops and wages. As a result, they were instantly re-enslaved. Most African Americans worked hard the entire year but ended up in debt. This guaranteed free labor in the South well into the 1960s. Sharecroppers who attempted to walk away from the South were tortured, raped, beat, lynched, and shot. In 1916, the first Great Migration began. Around this time, African Americans exited the South in large numbers. African Americans perceived that whites in the North were less racist than whites in the South. Northern cities provided factory jobs that allowed African Americans to earn twice as much as they did in the South. At this time, World War I was underway, and many factories substituted absentee whites with African Americans. The war also reduced the number of European immigrants that entered the country. Once again, the United States of America depended on the labor of African Americans to survive. When white men returned from the war, they competed with the African American men for jobs. Company used African Americans from the South to work as whites went on strike. Resentment from the whites toward African Americans led to racial violence throughout the 1910s and 1920s. African American communities in East St. Louis, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., New York, Rosewood, Elaine, Omaha, Manhattan Beach, and Tulsa, Oklahoma went up in flames. Whites murdered thousands of African American men, women, and children all across the country. They burned down their homes, communities, businesses, and stole their land. The most tragic year during the Great Migration was in 1919. More than 40 racially motivated riots took place across the country. Historians refer to these events as Red Summer. In Chicago, a riot began after an African American boy was stoned to death while swimming on the white side of the lake. As a result, over 1,000 African American families were left homeless in the Windy City. Some African Americans achieved great success after leaving the South, but they could not escape racism. One of the most infamous massacres that occurred in the United States took place in the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street. On May 30th, 1921, a black teenager was accused of attacking a white teenage girl. As a result, about 10,000 black people were left homeless, and property damage amounted to more than 1.5 million in real estate and 750,000 in personal property, which would be close to $30 million. A range of reports estimated that there were 75 to 300 people killed during the massacre. This is your boy Taye Uhuru. You are tuned in to Global Black History 365. Each week we will hit you off with some of the greatest achievements by black kings and queens from around the world. We will explore the black history in Brazil, India, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Russia, France, Spain, the Philippines, Australia, and many more places. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And always remember, before there was any history, there was black history.